Welcome back to Required Reading. I'm Russ, and today we're continuing our read of the novelization of the movie Gremlins. This is Chapter 2. For a long moment, Billy resisted the urge to deliver a good swift kick to the side of the perverse Volkswagen. Then he lashed out, driving his boot solidly against the rusting spot where the rear fender met the car's body. He was immediately sorry. Not just because he was rewarded with a jolt of pain in his toe. The car, a '69, was old and usually provided him with reasonably dependable transportation. The heating vent resisted all efforts to open and close according to Billy's will, but had to be either opened all the way or jammed completely shut. There were various shudders and groans that tried Billy's patience, but as they were all intermittent, a term used by the garage men when they were unable to find the trouble's source, he and the car somehow adjusted to each other. But why did it always seem to conk out when he was late for work? Last night had been just as cold, perhaps colder than this morning. He hadn't especially wanted the pizza, and he certainly experienced no joy in being the one to go and get it. Why hadn't the bug coughed and sputtered and died then? He sighed, looked at his watch, and winced. If he could be shot directly out of a cannon into the bank, he would be only a minute late. He glanced about him. The streets of quaint Kingston Falls, population 6,122, were deserted, as they always seemed to be when you needed a lift or were looking for company. Some might have called it a boring town, but having lived all of his 21 years here, Billy liked it. He and Kingston Falls somehow seemed right for each other, having down-to-earth qualities in common. When his mother used to say things like that, the Billy Peltzer of a few years ago had often grown sulky, dispirited, and occasionally hostile. Now he realized that he was average, a B minus or B plus, depending on the taste of the feminine onlooker. His hair, dark and worn as long as the bank executives would allow, framed a longish face, a pair of dark, earnest eyes, and a wide, expressive mouth. His skin, he thanked the Lord, had passed the acne stage. Either that or the zits were in a state of remission. Definitely not muscular. He was too well filled out to be called wiry. His was the body that even a high school football coach would have had difficulty assigning to a position. He was too small for the line, a bit too chunky for whippet-like receivers, not quite strong enough for a running back, and so because Kingston Falls put more emphasis on participation than winning, Billy Peltzer spent 2 years in the school's defensive backfield. The high point of his career came not when he intercepted a pass and ran it back for a game-winning touchdown, but when he recovered a fumble that salvaged a tie, all that stood between Kingston Falls and a totally winless season. After graduation, he didn't go to college because he simply didn't know what he wanted to be in life, and it seemed a shame to have his folks shell out good money while he decided. Following in his father's footsteps would have been like tracking a squirrel through a forest. Part inventor, part traveling salesman, Rand Peltzer had a resume that resembled the parts list for an aircraft carrier. Billy knew he didn't want a similarly nomadic existence. Yet he was so hard-pressed to define his goals that his friend Gene Grzinski, now nearly through engineering college, once suggested that he try to become a day watchman at a drive-in theater. Instead, Billy took a post-high school aptitude test, which revealed that he would do well working in a bank. The test did not say how well he would do if he continued to arrive late, however. "Broke down again?" The voice, a familiar tone, belonged to Murray Futterman, the garrulous neighbor around the corner, who was now seated behind the wheel of his bright red snowplow. Whenever it snowed, Futterman hopped on his plow and helped clean the streets, partly as a public service and partly, Billy suspected, because it gave him a better opportunity to jaw with people. You need to jump, Billy. No thanks, Billy replied. It's not the battery. I just put a new one in. I think it's the connection. Or it's just made up its mind it's stubborn for a while. Futterman pulled on his brake and descended from the snowplow's fur-lined seat. Inwardly, Billy groaned, knowing he had no time to waste. Futterman meant well, but he could use 10 minutes telling a 30-second story. Thanks, Mr. Futterman, Billy said quickly, walking away from his car and towards the street, in the hopes of sidetracking the well-intentioned neighbor. I'm gonna walk. I'm already late for work now. He might just as well have spoken in Sanskrit, or performed a few bird imitations. Nodding genially as he brushed past him, Futterman looked closely at the Volkswagen. No good foreign cars, he said, shaking his head. They always freeze up on you. Billy hesitated, not yet desperate enough to just start walking to work in the cold. Futterman was harmless, and occasionally even helpful. For a long moment he stood looking at the car, his straight black hair hanging limply across his forehead. Well into his 50s, Futterman looked younger, yet because of his garrulous nature and fuddy-duddy attitude, he somehow seemed older as well. Doesn't happen with the American machinery, he said. Our stuff can stand up to anything. No sense arguing the point, Billy thought. Forcing a tight smile, which he hoped Futterman would take as an apology for his buying such defective foreign product, and dropped the subject, Billy opened his mouth to reiterate his dilemma, gesturing up the street as he did so. The words died in the wake of Futterman's next verbal onslaught. See that snowplow? He smiled. 15 years old. Hasn't given me a day of trouble. Know why? Obviously, it was a rhetorical question. Again, Billy's mouth opened, but no words came forth. It's because it's not some foreign piece of junk, Futterman answered himself. Kentucky Harvester. You never see a snowplow as good as that one. Company went out of business because they were too good. Hear that, boy? Too good. Billy shrugged. He tried to look sad, not a difficult maneuver in light of the fact that he might be fired in a few minutes. That's real nice, Mr. Futterman, he said. I mean, it's nice it's such a great plow. It's too bad that they went out of business. But I gotta go. Really. Hop on, I'll give you a lift, Futterman offered. Billy weighed the situation. Nothing else on the road was moving, and as most people had not yet shoveled their sidewalks, walking was going to be slow. At least Futterman's plow could get him to the bank faster than he could move on foot, if... Futterman horned in on Billy's hesitation. I'll go straight to the bank, he promised. That's where you work, right? Yes, sir. Come on, I'll open her up full. We'll be there in no time. Billy hopped up next to Futterman, and they started off. As they did so, Billy groaned. What's the matter? Futterman asked. Mom must have let Barney out, Billy said. Now he'll follow me to work. Sure enough, in an instant, the yellowish-brown mutt with large ears, he was somehow between a beagle and an Irish setter, had leapfrogged across the heavily drifted snow until he was next to Futterman's snowplow. His roomy, dark eyes looked up lovingly at Billy. Want me to stop so you can take him back? Futterman asked, his hand reaching for the brake. No, it's all right, Billy said. I can tie him under the counter at the bank. Mr. Corbin won't like it, but if Barney's quiet, maybe we can get away with it until lunchtime. Futterman nodded and gunned the snowplow forward. What's wrong with your car? He asked. I'm not sure, Billy replied glumly. It's intermittent. Sometimes it works fine, even in the freezing weather. Other times it won't start, even when it's nice. Sounds like Gremlins to me. You mean all those cars used to act like that? Futterman laughed. Guess you're too young to recognize the word gremlin is anything but an American Motors car, he said. What else is it? A little devil, Futterman said. They love to fool around with machinery.
Saw a lot of them in World War II. I was a tail gunner on the Flying Fortress. Bet you didn't know that.
Billy shook his head, even as he tried to remember whether one of Futterman's endless ramblings had once contained that information. Looking at Futterman now and doing some quick arithmetic, he was amazed the man was old enough to have taken part in the conflict that had ended nearly 4 decades ago. He was old, of course, but somehow Billy automatically coupled World War II veterans with men in rocking chairs or nursing homes. Compared to them, Futterman was very much alive. Billy said the diplomatically correct and, as it turned out, accurate thing. You must have been a teenager. Futterman nodded.
18 when I went in. 19 when it was over. I saw a lot of life in those 12 months.
I'll bet.
Most important thing I learned was that gremlins really exist. You gotta keep watching for them.
Billy couldn't suppress a smile.
You think I'm pulling your leg.
Futterman deadpanned.
But it's true. Like I said, they like to fool around with machinery. With all them planes flying, World War II was their meat. Let me tell you, those gremlins were everywhere during the war. I mean, all over our ships and planes. I think that's why our machinery is better than that foreign stuff. In the war, we learned to deal with the gremlins and make our equipment better. For some reason, gremlins didn't go after the Japanese and Germans the way they went after us.
Why was that? Billy asked.
Don't know for sure. I think it's because our side, had a better sense of humor. You know how human nature is. It's like, well, you only play tricks on people who laugh, right? After a while, you don't play tricks on people who get all ruffled, because it's no fun. That's why the gremlins took after us. Half the time, we'd end up laughing at what they do.
And what did they do?
You name it. Now, I was a tail gunner, right? They'd knock my sights out of line so I'd miss, or they'd chisel tiny holes in the glass window so cold air would get in. They'd even slide down the gun barrel and jam the trigger as I was about to fire. Or they'd stick a pin in my rear just as I was about to fire.
Billy laughed. You actually saw them?
Yes and no,
Futterman replied.
You would see them out of the corner of your eye, but just as you shot them a full glance, they duck out of view.
Sounds like you're making them up, Mr. Futterman, Billy said candidly.
No, they were there. Other guys saw them and would swear to it. Now, Jackson, he was my navigator. He used to see them outside the plane all the time, dancing in the slipstream of the wing, or they'd chew little bits of rubber out of the de-icing boot on the wing's leading edge so we'd pick up ice. Sometimes they'd make sputtering noises in the pilot's ear so he'd think one of the engines was missing. They could even imitate our voices. Once they snuck up to our pilot and shouted,
"You're flying upside down, you fool."
That was really a close one, 'cause the pilot turned us over in a split second. You should have seen how the coffee cups and maps and people went sailing every which way.
But that could have been dangerous, Billy said. From the way you described them, I thought the gremlins were just playful.
Oh, they were. They didn't mean to put us in dangerous situations. But some of the pranks turned out that way.
The snowplow crossed the intersection of Carver and Clark, a normally busy corner now nearly deserted except for a few cars nearly buried in drifted snow. Looking at his watch, Billy noted that he was 10 minutes late, but he was comforted by the fact that with luck he'd make it before the bank opened to its customers.
Before the war was over, we learned to deal with all kinds of them,
Futterman continued.
Strato gremlins were the worst. They used to show up above 10,000 feet. Spadulas were middle-aged gremlins, and Finellas were females. There were also jerps and midgets. Each kind was different. But there was a song we used to sing.
Fearing the worst, Billy looked away from Futterman, noting with mixed emotions that Barney was trotting behind them, apparently determined to follow them no matter how far they traveled. A moment later, the rasp of Futterman's snowplow engine blended with his off-key singing voice.
When you're 1,000 miles from nowhere, and there's nothing below but the drink, it's then you'll see the gremlins, grim and gamboge and gold, male and female and neuter, gremlins both young and old. White ones will wiggle your wingtips, male ones will muddle your maps, green ones will guzzle your glycol, females will flutter your flaps. They'll freeze up your camera shutters. They'll bite through your airline wires. They'll bend, they'll break, they'll batter. They'll jam toasting forks in your eyes. They'll...
A giant convulsion of the snowplow stunned Futterman to silence and nearly threw Billy off the side. A second explosion, accompanied by an arc of red fire, caused the engine to shudder.
Darn,
Futterman rasped, reaching forward to turn the ignition key. He lifted himself off the seat, pulled the hood latch, and grabbed the wrench from beneath the seat in one fluid motion.
don't worry, I know what it is.
He apologized.
Won't take me but a minute or two to adjust the darn thing.
Billy slid to the ground, gave Barney a pat, and called across the flat hood to Mr. Futterman. "I'll cut across Mrs. Deagle's," he said. "Thanks a lot for taking me this far."
It'll take me a second to get this thing working,
Futterman repeated.
It's the only thing that's wrong with this snowplow. It doesn't usually act up, but I guess I'll just talk about gremlins brought it up.
"Yeah," Billy laughed. "Thanks again." Leaving Futterman with his head thrust deeply into the engine well, Billy started to trot across the vast expanse of Mrs. Deagle's lawn, a carpet of virgin snow, marred only by a few squirrel tracks. Barney followed. As he moved along the edge of the property towards a break in the iron fence, Billy noted that once again Mrs. Deagle's place was the only piece of property in this main square of Kingston Falls with no Christmas lights. Even the Union Savings and Trust Bank, his place of employment, sported a double line of holiday lights, which twinkled in bright ironic contrast to that firm's new Get Tough policy with its customers. A beeping horn and crunch of car chains against packed snow diverted Billy's attention from further thoughts of disaffection concerning his employer.
Get out of the way, you dumb cat!
From the rolled-down window of the Kingston Falls police car protruded the thin, weasel-like face of Deputy Brent. In the passenger seat sat Sheriff Riley, a husky, friendly-faced man with thick, dark hair.
"Move, you stupid rat with legs!"
Brent yelled. The few pedestrians near the scene paused to watch. Billy, Dr. Molinaro, on his way to the office, and Father Bartlett, a white-haired elderly priest. Beneath the front wheel of the police cruiser crouched a large gray tabby cat, its refusal to move caused by either fear or stubbornness. As Brent continued to shout at the cat, a stream of happy chatter emanated from the car radio, contrasting sharply with his venom. "Good morning to you all late risers," the unseen voice warbled. "Rocking Rippy Rialto here with a list of school closings, but first let's listen to a Motown Christmas classic, the Jackson 5, bringing you some chestnuts roasting and on an open fire." A protracted blast on the horn overwhelmed the ebullient announcer. Simultaneously, Billy darted quickly into the street and grabbed the cat. "Thanks," Sheriff Riley smiled. "It's one of Mrs. Deagle's," Billy said.
"If I'd have known that," Brent groused, "I'd have kept right on driving."
Riley nodded, rolled up the window, and indicated that Brent should continue driving. After checking to make sure Barney was behind him, Billy started a diagonal path towards Mrs. Deagle's front door, the squirming cat tucked firmly in the crook of his arm. Even as he did so, he noticed the edge of the living room curtain fall and her sharp, unsmiling face disappear into the dark recesses of the house. Before he arrived at the front door, it opened to reveal Mrs. Deagle clad in a singularly unattractive house dress and obviously taken by surprise, judging from the lopsided position of her metallic auburn wig. Her lips were pursed. Her expression as formidable as that reserved for an IRS agent.
I told you not to walk on the grass,
she said sharply. Billy cast a quick glance behind at his footprints in the snow. I didn't walk on the grass, he responded. I walked on the snow.
Don't be smart,
Mrs. Deagle shot back. Billy shoved the cat at her, his eyes locking on her face for only an instant. Unlike most old people, whose faces shone with character and wisdom, Mrs. Deagle's expression generated only sadness and revulsion within him. Large, tacky earrings dangled from her ears, and her eyes were outlined by thick mascara-covered lashes through a heavy layer of ghostly white powder. Yellow teeth contrasted bizarrely with purplish-red lipstick smeared below and above the thin lips of her mouth. With her sharp, nervous gestures, she resembled an evil mannequin or puppet, the sort of creature Billy had seen in TV cartoon shows. Well, I brought your cat, he murmured softly. It was nearly run over by the police car. Mrs. Deagle took the animal, dropped it quickly to the floor behind her.
The way you were carrying her, it's lucky she can still walk,
Mrs. Deagle rasped. Billy shrugged.
All right, get off my porch. I hope you're not waiting around for a reward.
No, Mrs. Deagle, Billy replied. I guess a thank you was even too much to expect. With that, he turned and started off the porch with Barney. As her parting shot, he half heard Mrs. Deagle shout something about making sure Barney didn't befoul any of her precious shrubs. Mostly his mind was occupied with thoughts of self-loathing. Dummy, he said aloud. Should have known better than to bother. Dropping her cat in the yard would have been good enough. And would have gotten him to work a few minutes earlier, or less late, he thought, as he turned the corner of Mrs. Deagle's property. He began to run, a movement that caused Barney to do likewise. The sudden acceleration brought the dog into contact with a large ceramic snowman, the only frivolous object the old woman allowed on her property. Crinkled and spotted with tiny fracture lines, the snowman's head had started listing to its right several years before. Now, as Barney brushed the bottom of the figure, the head leaned sharply downwards, hesitated, and then rolled onto the snow. Peering at the departing figures from her dining room window, Mrs. Deagle inhaled sharply as the ceramic head of the snowman disappeared into the snow.
Those destructive little beasts,
she hissed.
I'll get both of them for that.
She watched silently as young Billy Peltzer and his dog went into the bank, a look of determination slowly replacing her expression of horror. Then, righting her wig before the dining room mirror, she made the decision that had eluded her so far this morning, whether or not to brave the elements in order to take care of some business.
Bless the snow, she said now. It'll be worth getting my feet wet to teach that young punk a lesson.